Opho looked around sadly at what used to be the third largest settlement on Zaalia 5. The Khekuvuk had colonized the world less than 30 solar cycles ago. Not long by normal standards, but they were making good use of its mild climate and mineral wealth. But with success comes greed, and their longtime tormentors, the Grail. They'd attacked the colony within 2 of this planet's days. The main settlement managed to get off a distress signal before the Grail destroyed the subspace transmitter. Without that, the Khekuvuk colonists couldn't transmit to one of the other planets, let alone out of the system. Opho had been studying the rings of the furthermost planet of the system when he received the distress call. He warped to a position within the local asteroid belt to observe. He hoped to try and rescue some of his people, but the Grail had far too many ships in space for him to sneak by. His people were not a warlike species. They preferred working the land and creating fine pieces of art that were treasured across the galaxy. Their adeptness at carving or working with metal to create statues or symbols was especially sought after. Many worlds had statues of their important people that were created by Khekuvuk crafters. The Grail preferred not to pay for Khekuvuk artwork or other decorations. They'd just raid one of our colonies and take both our people and wealth back to their systems. Despite complaining to the Celestial Confederation, nothing was done but unenthusiastic condemnation of the Grail's actions. They were far too strong for all but a couple of members of the Confederation, and the Rateri and the Jezerk just didn't care. The newest race to join the Confederation was an enigma. The Terrans, or humans as they preferred, were friendly to many of the races and recently began setting up trade deals. They weren't weak. The Twillerk found that out the hard way when they sent invasion fleets into Terran space. The initial invasion had moderate success against the Terrans' low space tech levels, but they managed to drive the Twillerks off their world and then their system within a mere 25 solar cycles, or 50 of their years. The Twillerk sent a larger force within 5 solar cycles and were greeted by a nasty surprise. The human fleet that greeted them was equal, if not advanced, to the Twillerk tech level. Some of the design elements were obviously taken from ships they captured and then re-engineered. Despite being outnumbered almost 2 to 1, the humans crippled or killed over 90% of the Twillark fleet with the rest fleeing. The humans only lost a third of their fleet but were in a far better position to recover their wrecked ships and rescue survivors. They even rescued and took a large number of Twillark prisoners. Unlike most species, they didn't massacre them or make sport of them. They traded them back as part of a peace treaty that required the Twillark to recognize Terran sovereignty and return any humans held against their will. No loss of territory, no massive reparations, or their people being taken into slavery. The Twillark were taken aback at such generous terms. Some of the Confederacy wondered why the Twillark would sign such a thing without any of their possessions being occupied. They did it because several of their high-ranking officers that were caught by the Terrans and sent back home as a sign of goodwill told them what they'd seen as prisoners. Their people still held prisoner were not mistreated, despite the actions of the occupation troops left on Terra. But they also saw the other side of their character, the part that wanted revenge on the Twillark military and the rapidly advancing level of technology. Their industrial capacity was to be feared, and it was obvious that Terra would soon pass them in tech level, and the Terran military would soon be large enough to seize the home planet. So they accepted peace and even began significant trading between them. Maybe even more surprising, a sizable number of Twillark refugees were accepted by the Terrans after the majority of Twillark territory was destroyed when their star went nova. And now Twillarks were considered members of Terran society, a very strange people. So he was only slightly surprised when a Terran fleet jumped into space within 500 TKA of the planet. Opho watched in amazement as the smaller Terran fleet obliterated the much larger Grail ships. And so, Opho was able to join the humans as they landed troops on the planet's surface. Which is how he came to be standing in the remains of a settlement that once contained 150,000 of his people. Only a handful managed to hide well enough to escape the slaughter. They described a Grail force that numbered over 500,000 troops and slaver gangs. They'd managed to overhear the Gre'l's plan to break up into smaller groups and attack everywhere. Opho stood back and listened while the human commander, or commandant in their rank system, gave out orders to her troops. Opho answered any questions she had and even helped calm the terrified survivors and convince them the humans are friends. Opho even managed to convince a few to act as guides for groups of human soldiers, showing them around the settlement, where to find water, and finding the kind of terrain features the humans wanted for defensive positions. Others helped remove and bury the dead, the humans treating them with great respect as they did so. Opho was very surprised to even see some Twi'leks amongst the troops they called engineers because of their high aptitude for mathematics and other sciences. One of the humans told me, "They are some of the best engineers and technicians in the Terran military. They can even be officers and order human soldiers around. A very, very strange people." Opho knew of no other military that mixed species on an equal level. The ones that did have other species in their armies used them as slave labor or cannon fodder. As the commandant was explaining the plan to Opho, to dig in and wait for reinforcements to arrive over the next 2 days, she said another 2 Marine legions and 4 Army legions would be arriving. At Opho's confusion, she explained each legion contained 5,000 troops broken into 10 cohorts of 500 each. Each legion was self-sufficient in the types of troops needed, except armored vehicles. 9 cohorts were specifically combat soldiers, and the 10th were not only combat soldiers but contained their medical staff, engineers and comms techs, artillery and heavy weapons. The rest were part of her HQ group. Opho listened raptly to all this and decided he needed to explain this to Elder Odir and members of the Khekuvuk Grand Council. They must become able to protect themselves in the future. Opho didn't even notice until the young soldier spoke up, less than an arm span away. Opho still had trouble with their speech when they talked too fast, so just followed the commandant when she asked him to join her. They ended up at the settlement's public gathering building. The settler that had been guiding the humans was squatting down with a look of pure misery and resignation. The humans had a completely different and slightly baffling look: anger. Opho later learned anger was an understatement. They were furious. When Opho peeked in, he was saddened but not surprised to find that all of the settlement's children had been brought in here and massacred. The Grail had even made sport of some of them. Nothing we've not seen before. Opho felt the great sorrow but resignation his people felt in this situation. They could not stop it but had to deal with it. Opho quickly learned the humans were different. Murdering children was one of their greatest taboos, especially in warfare. Accidents happen and that does sadden them, but to do it deliberately, that is unforgivable. They call it a war crime, and they exact a harsh punishment on anyone, even their own people, that commit them. Opho listened as the commandant gave orders for everyone to view this and to prepare for action. The voice she used when she told a subordinate to find the closest group was so full of anger that Opho actually backed up a step. Even as her troops viewed the horror, even the Twi'leks were angry, despite their own people having done similar things in the past. She began getting them ready for combat. Once the 3 cohorts she ordered had viewed the slaughter, she ordered them to suit up, she called it, and head for the dropships that had brought them to the planet. She also ordered some of what they called heavy weapons to join her. Crew-served railguns, what they called mortars, and a rifle as tall as the soldier wielding it. They said it was to wreck things like big guns, vehicles, and some buildings. Each soldier was outfitted in a form of very strong ceramic armor that covered their torso, with separate pieces for their arms and legs. Their helmets covered most of their head and had a face shield that could cover their face. They had some sort of communication devices in the helmet and a way to see farther away or into the visual spectrum that, unlike us, normally could not. Those were joined together by something they called advanced Kevlar, not as strong as the ceramic pieces, but allowed excellent mobility. It was also able to resist more melee weapons and claws. Whether it could hold up to Gre'l talons, fangs, and their spiked tail is yet to be seen. They had a pair of retractable blades in the gauntlet of their dominant hand. They all had some other form of melee weapons. He recognized swords, but not the other types. They used a process that allowed them to cut through all but the strongest of the many forms of armor, carapaces, or other natural defenses. Opho was told it was a military secret when he asked how they made them so strong, to the point they self-destructed if handled by a non-human. The Twi'lek had their own version. Upon asking, he learned the other weapons were called war hammers, several different kinds of axes, war pick, and a spiked mace. They all looked like terrible things to be on the wrong end of. Their main weapon was some type of rifle that fired several different types of ammo. It also had some sort of retractable spike on the underside of the barrel. For some reason, they referred to it as a can opener. Opho tried to explain that no one with any desire to live went into close combat with the Gre'l. Their size, their strength, their natural weapons, and their strong natural armor. The commandant wasn't impressed even with their nasty tails. She told me they had a creature that had a similar tail called a megascorpion. She said some idiot was playing with the genetics of the smaller version and created a larger version. They just simply lopped off the tail as early as possible. A very, very strange people. Opho was surprised to see the commandant would lead this group and asked to go along. As long as he stayed out of the way, was the answer. A group of 10,000 Grail were attacking a settlement that was only 24 TKA away. We arrived in less than 5 human minutes, but instead of immediately attacking the Grail, they set down further away. They found a small valley barely out of the sight from the village. Despite being hugely outnumbered, one cohort of them trotted off to the settlement. The other 2 dug holes and trenches on either side of the valley and concealed them. I knew where they were and could hardly see them. Another trench was dug further back in the valley floor, but not all of it was hidden. The railguns were placed there, but well hidden. The same of the mortars, but much further back. I don't know where the human with the really big gun went. When asked, the commandant called it an ambush, a way to surprise the enemy and kill more than if they saw them coming. Opho laughed and told the commandant that the Grail aren't known to be quick thinkers and can be too stubborn to change the first plan. The smile the commandant gave was very scary, like a large predator stalking its prey. She also explained the cohort that went towards the settlement were going to attack the Grail and then get them to chase them right into the trap, and that is why that trench on the valley floor isn't hidden like the others. It wasn't long before Opho heard the sizzling sound made by Grail pulse rifles and the louder pop-pop sound of the human weapons. His people had excellent eyesight, so he saw the humans retreating before the commandant did, with the Grail chasing them. She just said good before thanking him and asking him to keep her up to date until the humans could see them unaided. She then explained it prevented them from wasting time while waiting for their vision to adjust to the difference. Opho began to see the human troops better. They would run so far and then turn to shoot. They were very good shots and Gre'l were falling but kept coming. Some humans were carrying or helping others. Wounded was the word. Sadly, he saw some humans fall down and not get up again, shot by Grail weapons. He told the commandant what he saw and she turned to give orders with a tinge of sadness in her voice for her lost soldiers. Most other species officers don't care that much when they are killed in battle. A trickle of humans began to enter the valley and pass the hidden positions. Most jumped into the trenches and faced towards the Gre'l. A few carried wounded comrades further back to treatment. The last few humans entered the valley, followed by several Gre'l. Those were shot by the humans that had fallen back into the trench. Opho looked at the commandant and she whispered they wanted a lot more Grail in before they attacked. The Gre'l began to enter in larger numbers and kept falling to shots from the trench. Opho finally saw the Grail war leader coming towards them. The Grail also stopped running into the valley as individuals. The war leader was easy to see. He was almost twice the size of his fighters. They are too disorganized to be called soldiers. Opho explained this to the commandant and she whispered something into her comms. Opho was starting to feel the first feeling of panic. 1,500 humans versus 10,000 Grail? We didn't stand a chance. Opho heard the war leader shout something and a group of maybe 500 headed towards them. He once again passed this on. The humans held their fire as the Grail came running into the valley, or what they call running. They aren't that fast, as seen by how easily the humans outrun them, even having to slow down to keep them coming. The humans still held their fire until the first line passed our position. The Grail stopped to fire, but then the humans in the trench opened fire all at once. Not one Grail got a shot off. With so much noise, the commandant was able to speak without worrying they would hear us. She pointed out a distinct pile of rocks and told Opho to tell her when the war leader got close to or past that spot. She just winked when Opho asked why and told him he'd find out. While he was distracted, almost all of the Grail had been killed and a few were running away. At Opho's glance, the commandant explained the few that escaped would both tell the war leader there was only that small group and would start to spread fear among the other troops. Opho was getting quite the education today. The war leader sent in an even larger group. They approached the valley entrance and gave a loud yell as they charged. Once again, they waited for them to pass our position before the human line opened fire. And once again, the furthest ahead went down like Berter in a game of podkells. But now they were starting to get closer to the line. Some humans stopped firing entirely and pulled out their melee weapons. Maybe 100 reached the human lines and an epic fight began. Some humans are still shooting, but some using their other weapons on the Grail. The Gre'l's cheers at being able to get the humans. Here and there, a human was ripped apart by Grail talons or had flesh ripped out from Gre'l fangs. But Opho watched them lop off the Grail tails. Very few Grail were able to land blows, and even then only once. A handful of Grail ran away, only a couple of humans fired after them. Were they out of ammo? Is that why the Grail got into the trench? At least 15 humans were killed or severely wounded when they fought within the reach of Grail. Once again, a glance at the commandant's face showed she wasn't worried. The air became rank with the smell of death. Blood, shit, vomit of bodies ripped open by the projectiles of the humans. And almost all of it, Gre'l. So far, the battle was heavily in favor of the humans. Around 1,700 Grail were dead or injured. The humans had less than 20 killed and 3 too hurt to fight. But that still left a lot of Gre'l. This time, roughly 3,000 plus Grail advanced into the valley, then even marched in, not bothering to run because the humans were out of ammo. When only a dozen humans opened fire, you could see their confidence grow. They didn't even unsling their rifles. They wanted to rip the hate humans apart with their talons and fangs. They got closer to where the humans usually fired on them, but only 1 or 2 shots. A handful of humans even ran away. The rest readied their melee weapons. They were halfway to the humans. A huge bang, followed by a mechanical whine, rang out from concealed positions behind and slightly above the trench. The Gre'l weren't knocked down so much as turned into a green mist as their bodies just exploded. Each shot would pass through several soldiers before stopping. The troops that ran away came back to the trench. Melee weapons were switched back for rifles, and their packages of flying metal were added to the destruction. It had been a trick. They had plenty of ammo, but that trick made the Grail overconfident. This time, not a single one was allowed to escape. The war leader had lost half of his men already. He advanced with the rest of his warriors to kill these puny humans. Surely this was enough to crush them. Opho watched and waited. Some Grail were already entering the valley and stopping to shoot at the trench line, but got few hits. The crush of Grail behind them caused them to stop firing and move forward. At the point that the war leader passed the marker, almost a third of his men had entered the valley. Opho told the commandant the war leader had passed the marker. She just whispered, "Take him down now." Then she quickly whispered to Opho, "Watch him." There was a massive bang that echoed across the valley, so startling that even the Grail stopped to look around. But Opho saw what happened. The round took the war leader right in the torso. It exploded with his limbs and head all going different directions. The head launched straight up before landing amongst his men. The projectile continued on and ripped another dozen Grail to pieces. The Grail were so shocked that they lost focus and either stopped dead in their tracks or ran about, screaming what I assume was the war leader's name. That's when the railguns and troopers in the trench opened fire. Dozens of Grail died in seconds. Then the mortars added their little packages of death from above. Fountains of dirt and body parts erupted on each impact. They focused on the entrance to the valley so they couldn't escape. The sniper began shooting the Grail still outside the valley, goading them and killing whole rows with each shot. If the reload was any faster, he'd have killed them all. The rest finally had enough and charged in. They were so enraged that they dropped their rifles to charge faster. The bodies of the dead and dying Grail began to pile up so high that the Marines in the trench had to wait for them to pop their heads over it. Once the bulk of the Grail had entered the valley, the last of the trap was sprung. Hundreds of rifles opened up from both sides of the valley. The Grail let out a loud wail once they finally understood it was a trap. The mortar began dropping liquid fire across the neck of the valley, and then bringing back the rain of death. The sniper began taking out any of the groups that tried to charge the fire. The Grail didn't even know which way to attack. Some charged the trench again and died. Some tried to climb the hills and died. Some tried to run past the fire and died. Some just milled around and died. But that wasn't enough for the humans. When only a few hundred were left alive, the commandant yelled, "Charge!" into her microphone. Almost as one, the Marines rose and jumped out of their trenches, some dropping rifles for their melee weapons, others deploying the spike, bayonet as they called it, and crashed into the disorganized mob. They gave a wordless shout of rage as they attacked the Gre'l. They stabbed, they shot, they crushed, and they impaled the surviving Grail. This wasn't the disciplined war machine that had used tricks and tactics to destroy most of the Gre'l army. This was a horde of humans supercharged with rage at the Grail's killing of civilians, but the deliberate massacre of children. They swarmed over them, not content to just quickly kill them, but stabbing their swords and bayonets into them over and over. Their axes and warpick cleaved them apart, and the warhammers and maces crushed in their armor, their helmets and their heads. Some weren't even satisfied with that, but used the bladed weapons on their gauntlet to smash struggling Grail in the face over and over again. One human even pried open a Grail's crocodile-like jaw and ripped his lower jaw off before clubbing it to death with the butt of his rifle. The Grail never had a chance. They tried to fight back, but the humans mobbed them. They got very few chances to kill or wound a human. The few that managed to flee were run down by the fastest humans, kicked and beaten to death. The savagery both horrified and pleased Opho. He'd never seen that level of violence. But the Grail were finally paying the price for their actions. The cries of the Grail faded away until a single one wasn't left alive. The humans were covered in the green blood of the Grail. The humans removed their dead and injured from the assortment of Grail parts or lumps of what had been Grail. They took a moment to rest before cleaning up the battlefield. But they didn't do this in the usual fashion of burying the dead. Their dropships landed, and all the bodies and parts of the Grail were loaded into large containers. When they finally found the war leader's head, it was left aside for a special use. It took 3 whole dropships with their cargo holds completely full of the ghastly cargo to get it all. The Grail's weapons and equipment were destroyed, aside from a few for study. The commandant invited Opho to see what they planned to do with the remains. So Opho found himself in the cockpit of a dropship as each dropship went a different way. To the 3 largest camps they'd found so far. Grail overconfidence meant they brought few heavy weapons or anti-air to the planet's surface. What they had with them were left on the ships in orbit, the same ships that were making bright streaks in the sky as their wreckage burned up in the planet's atmosphere. So there was no danger to the dropships when they hovered out of Grail weapon range and disgorged the remains of their former comrades on them. And then they returned to their base. They found the returning Marines beset by comrades yelling questions at them, but they quickly fell silent when their fallen comrades were brought from the dropships. Their casualties were light for the action fought against superior numbers, but that was for the reports. To them, these were their comrades, their brothers and sisters in arms, the honored dead. They were taken to what was being called the morgue. They would be buried at sunrise as per centuries-old tradition. The commandant and Opho finally emerged to loud cheering for both. The returning Marines had told tales of his assistance and aiding the sniper to kill the war leader, but first to shower and change uniforms, then the military tradition of unexciting chow. Then they celebrated. Opho's people even joined in the fun. The next battle could wait, and Opho's request for volunteers to work with the Marines just like he had done. Opho and the commandant had discussed this on the way back. Opho finished his report for Elder Odhir and members of the Khekuvuk Grand Council. Opho finished with, "They are a very strange people, but they can become very good friends and allies. I recommend we strengthen our ties with them. I strongly recommend an official proclamation telling our people, never piss off the humans.